The Son of Ember in Appalachia, the child who couldn't tell fever from life. In the forgotten valleys of eastern Kentucky, where the Appalachian mountains rise like ancient guardians of secrets too dark to speak, there existed a family whose name was whispered with equal parts pity and revulsion. The year was 1968, and in a hollow so remote that even the postman refused to venture beyond the creek crossing, the Ember family had lived for 6 generations without allowing a single drop of outside heritage to dilute their lineage. This is the story of what happens when family trees refuse to branch, when the same faces appear in every generation, and when a child is born who cannot distinguish the burning of illness from the burning of existence itself. The Ember homestead sat at the end of a dirt path that wound through dense woodland for nearly 4 miles. The main house, a sagging structure of weathered timber and rusted tin roofing, seemed to lean into the hillside as if trying to burrow back into the earth that spawned it. Surrounding this central dwelling were 3 smaller cabins, each more dilapidated than the last, creating a compound that housed 23 members of the same bloodline. To understand the Ember family, one must first understand the geography that shaped them. The hollow they occupied had been claimed by Patriarch Josiah Ember in 1872, a Civil War deserter who sought isolation from a world he believed had descended into chaos. Josiah brought with him his wife Martha and their 5 children, establishing a settlement based on principles of self-reliance and, more critically, absolute separation from outsiders. What began as simple isolation evolved over decades into something far more sinister. Josiah's children married one another. His grandchildren did the same. By the time the 1960s arrived, the Ember family tree resembled not a tree at all, but a twisted vine that looped back upon itself again and again, creating a genetic tangle that would make any biologist recoil in horror. The physical manifestations of this continuous interbreeding were evident in nearly every family member. Shortened limbs, clouded eyes, speech impediments that rendered communication difficult even among themselves, and a peculiar shuffling gait that characterized the Ember walk. But none bore the consequences more profoundly than the child born on a frigid January morning in 1968, a boy they named Caleb. Caleb Ember entered the world under circumstances that would have prompted immediate medical intervention in any other context. His mother, Rebecca, was simultaneously his aunt, his cousin, and distantly his sister through the incomprehensible web of relations that defined the Ember clan. His father, Thomas, shared similar multiple relationships to the child. The midwife who attended the birth, herself an Ember by both birth and marriage, later told neighbors in the nearest town that the infant emerged with a temperature that seemed impossibly high, yet he neither cried nor showed distress. His skin held a constant flush, as though perpetually sunburned, and his small body radiated heat that could be felt from inches away. The family, isolated from modern medicine and suspicious of outsiders, interpreted this as a sign of special blessing. They called him their child of fire, their Ember within Ember. What they did not understand, what they could not comprehend through their limited education and deliberate isolation, was that Caleb's body was failing in ways both subtle and catastrophic. The genetic damage from 6 generations of close interbreeding had created in Caleb a nervous system that could not properly regulate temperature. His hypothalamus, the small region of the brain responsible for maintaining body heat within safe parameters, had developed abnormally. To Caleb, the sensation of fever and the sensation of normal existence were indistinguishable because he had never known anything different. By the time he reached 5 years old, Caleb had developed into a child whose appearance unsettled even his own family members. His eyes, a pale blue that seemed almost white in certain light, held an unfocused quality that suggested he saw the world through a permanent haze. His skin maintained its ruddy flush, stretched tight over bones that had grown unevenly, leaving his left leg slightly shorter than his right. and his spine curved in a way that forced him to lean perpetually forward. His hair grew in patches, leaving bare spots across his scalp that his mother tried unsuccessfully to cover with a wool cap, even in summer. But it was Caleb's behavior that truly marked him as different, even within a family where difference was the norm. He would sit for hours near the wood stove, pressing his small hands against the hot metal until the smell of burning flesh filled the cabin. When pulled away, he would cry, not from pain, but from separation, reaching back toward the heat source with desperate urgency. He slept fitfully, throwing off blankets even on the coldest nights, his body seeking coolness it could never achieve. During rare moments of physical exertion, playing in the yard with cousins who were also his siblings and nephews in the family's tangled genealogy, Caleb would suddenly collapse, his already high body temperature spiking to levels that should have triggered seizures or worse. The family's response to Caleb's condition revealed the depth of their isolation from modern understanding. Thomas Ember, accepting his role as father despite also being uncle and cousin to the boy, believed that Caleb's heat was a manifestation of strong heritage, that the boy carried within him the concentrated essence of the Ember bloodline. Rebecca, worn beyond her 26 years by multiple births and the physical toll of genetic deterioration, treated Caleb's condition with home remedies passed down through generations. Cool rags soaked in creek water, and teas brewed from mountain herbs that did nothing to address the fundamental dysfunction within the child's body. The other family members, ranging from Caleb's grandmother, who was also his aunt, to his siblings, who were also his cousins and nieces, watched the boy with a mixture of pride and unease. Sensing that something was profoundly wrong, but lacking the framework to understand what, Caleb's world existed within the boundaries of the Ember compound. He had never traveled beyond the hollow, never seen the small town of Hazard that lay 15 miles to the west, never encountered a person who did not share his surname and his heritage. His education consisted of basic letters and numbers taught by his mother from a single worn textbook that had belonged to her grandfather. He learned to identify plants, to understand the rhythms of seasons, to perform simple tasks around the homestead. But he learned nothing of the world beyond, nothing of science or medicine, nothing that might help him understand why his existence felt different from others, why the heat that consumed him from within seemed to separate him from everything around him. Confira-se já é inscrito neste canal, because what you're about to witness in the coming chapters will expose the devastating truth of what happens when families turn inward for generations, and you'll want to see how deep this tragedy truly goes. By the spring of 1973, Caleb had reached his 5th year, though he appeared much younger due to his stunted growth and the ravages his condition imposed on his small frame. The Ember compound had remained largely unchanged in the intervening years, a pocket of existence frozen in time while the rest of Appalachia slowly modernized around it. The family still had no electricity, no telephone, no connection to the infrastructure that was gradually reaching even the most remote mountain communities. They generated income through occasional sales of ginseng root and handmade items in Hazard, brief excursions into town that occurred perhaps 3 or 4 times yearly and always left the family members anxious to return to their isolated sanctuary. It was during this period that an outsider finally penetrated the Ember isolation, though not through any invitation or welcome. Sarah Henderson was a public health nurse assigned to the eastern Kentucky region, part of a federal program aimed at addressing the shocking health disparities that plagued the Appalachian Mountains. In the course of her rounds, visiting families in remote areas to check on children and provide basic medical screening, she had heard whispers about the Ember clan. Local residents spoke of them with discomfort, mentioning deformities and strange behaviors, but also with a reluctance to interfere that characterized mountain culture's respect for privacy and autonomy. even when that autonomy led to obvious suffering. Sarah first encountered the Ember family on a humid morning in May. She had driven her battered truck as far up the mountain path as possible before abandoning it and walking the final 2 miles on foot, following directions provided reluctantly by a store owner in Hazard. As she approached the compound, the first thing that struck her was the silence. No dogs barked, no chickens clucked, no sounds of normal homestead activity. Then the figures began to emerge from the cabins and main house, moving with that characteristic ember shuffle, their faces holding expressions that mixed curiosity and suspicion in equal measure. Sarah counted 18 individuals of various ages, though determining precise ages proved impossible given the physical irregularities that marked each person. Thomas Ember stepped forward as the apparent spokesman, his misshapen jaw working slowly as he formed words that came out slurred and difficult to parse. Sarah introduced herself, explained her mission, and requested permission to examine the children in the family to ensure they were healthy and developing properly. The resistance was immediate and fierce. Thomas insisted that Ember children were cared for by Ember hands, that outsiders brought disease and trouble, that the family had survived for generations without interference and needed none now. But Sarah had dealt with resistance before, and she employed a combination of patience, gentle persuasion, and subtle pressure, mentioning that the state had authority to ensure child welfare and that cooperation now would prevent more invasive intervention later. After nearly an hour of negotiation conducted in the yard, while family members looked on, Thomas grudgingly agreed to allow Sarah to examine the youngest children. She was led into the main house, a structure whose interior shocked her despite her years of working in impoverished communities. The single large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space was dark and smoky, heated by a wood stove that made the air thick and difficult to breathe. Bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling, and the floor consisted of bare boards worn smooth by generations of feet. In one corner, she saw Caleb for the first time. The boy sat unnaturally still, his pale eyes fixed on nothing in particular, his flushed skin gleaming with perspiration despite the fact that the other children appeared comfortable in the warm room. Sarah approached slowly, speaking in soft tones, but Caleb did not respond to her voice or acknowledge her presence. When she knelt beside him and gently touched his forehead, she recoiled at the heat radiating from his skin. She pulled a thermometer from her bag and, after several minutes of coaxing, managed to take Caleb's temperature. The reading was 103.7 degrees Fahrenheit, a fever that demanded immediate medical attention. Sarah turned to Rebecca, who had been hovering nearby, and asked how long the boy had been sick. Rebecca's response, delivered in the mountain dialect that Sarah had learned to parse, revealed the horrifying truth. Caleb was not sick. This was his normal state. He had been born this way and had lived his entire 5 years with a body temperature that fluctuated between 100 and 104 degrees, a range that should have been impossible to sustain. Sarah's medical training told her that this child needed hospitalization, needed specialists, needed interventions that went far beyond her capabilities as a public health nurse. But she also understood the dynamics at play. The deep suspicion of outsiders, the family's isolation, and their protective instincts, however misguided. She spent the next hour examining other children in the family, documenting a catalogue of genetic abnormalities that painted a clear picture of the consequences of sustained inbreeding. Cleft palates that had healed poorly without surgical intervention. Vision problems so severe that several children were functionally blind. Hearing loss, learning disabilities, skeletal malformations, and developmental delays that range from mild to profound. Every child showed some manifestation of genetic damage, but none as severe or as immediately life-threatening as Caleb's condition. Sarah took careful notes, knowing that what she documented would need to be reported, that intervention would be required regardless of the family's wishes. Before leaving, Sarah tried once more to convince Thomas and Rebecca to allow her to take Caleb to a hospital in Lexington, where specialists could evaluate his condition and attempt treatment. She explained that the boy's constant fever was damaging his organs, that his brain was being subjected to temperatures that killed cells and created irreversible harm, that without intervention he would not survive to adulthood, and that his remaining years would be marked by increasing disability and suffering. Thomas listened impassively, then delivered his response. The boy was Ember, would remain Ember, would be cared for by Embers. No outsider would take him, no hospital would touch him. This was final. Sarah left the compound that day with a heavy heart and a determination to act. She filed her report with state authorities, documenting the conditions and requesting intervention on behalf of the children, particularly Caleb. What followed was a bureaucratic process that moved with agonizing slowness. Kentucky in the 1970s had limited resources for child welfare, particularly in remote rural areas. The legal standards for removing children from families required clear evidence of active mistreatment or neglect. And while the Ember situation was disturbing, proving that the family's refusal of medical care constituted actionable neglect posed legal challenges. Months passed while Sarah advocated, filed additional reports, and tried to build a case for intervention. During this time, Caleb's condition gradually worsened. His body temperature began to spike higher and more frequently, reaching levels that triggered brief periods of confusion and disorientation. He would stand in the yard, swaying slightly, his eyes unfocused, speaking words that made no sense to those around him. His growth, already severely stunted, virtually stopped. By his 6th birthday, in January of 1974, he stood barely 3.5 feet tall, his body so thin that his ribs created stark shadows across his perpetually flushed skin. He ate little, his damaged hypothalamus disrupting not just temperature regulation, but also appetite control. Rebecca tried to force food into him, but he would gag and refuse, turning away from sustenance his body desperately needed. The other family members began to treat Caleb differently as his condition deteriorated. Where before they had viewed him with pride as a special child marked by intense heritage, they now looked at him with unease and growing fear. His constant heat, his strange behaviors, his increasing detachment from the world around him, all marked him as different even within a family defined by difference. Children who had once played with him now avoided him, unsettled by his vacant stares and his sudden collapses. Adults muttered among themselves, wondering if perhaps the heritage that ran so strong in their lineage had become too concentrated, too pure, creating in Caleb something that was simultaneously the ultimate Ember and something that should not exist at all. The winter of 1975 brought changes to the Ember compound that would prove catastrophic for young Caleb. Sarah Henderson had finally succeeded in obtaining a court order requiring the family to submit the children for medical evaluation, a legal victory that had taken nearly 2 years of persistent effort. The order was to be executed in February, with state officials and medical personnel scheduled to visit the compound and examine all children under the age of 12. For the Ember family, this represented an intolerable intrusion, a violation of their autonomy and their way of life that could not be permitted. Thomas called a family meeting in the main house on a bitterly cold evening in late January. All adult members of the clan gathered in the smoky room, their faces grave as Thomas outlined the situation. The government was coming. Outsiders would examine their children, would see the evidence of their intermarried heritage, would take the children away. This could not be allowed. The family discussed options with increasing desperation. Some suggested fleeing deeper into the mountains, abandoning the compound and establishing themselves somewhere even more remote. Others proposed armed resistance, defending their homestead against state intrusion. But Thomas, whose role as patriarch gave him final authority, proposed a different solution. The family would comply with the letter of the order, he announced, but only after taking steps to protect themselves. Those children whose conditions were most severe, whose appearances and disabilities most clearly revealed the consequences of their breeding practices, would be hidden during the examination. They would be taken to the furthest cabin, kept out of sight until the officials departed. The children who appeared relatively normal, who could speak and move and interact without immediate evidence of problems, would be presented for examination. This way, the family would appear to cooperate while concealing the full extent of their situation. The adults nodded in agreement, relieved to have a plan that allowed them to maintain some control. But there was one child whose condition made him impossible to hide effectively. One whose constant fever and obvious physical deterioration would immediately alarm any medical professional who encountered him. Caleb had become a liability, a living piece of evidence that could not be explained away or concealed. As the family discussed their strategy, with Caleb sitting in his usual corner near the stove, his presence simultaneously acknowledged and ignored, a darker suggestion began to emerge. Perhaps, someone ventured quietly, it would be better if Caleb was simply not present when the officials arrived. Perhaps he could be taken somewhere, kept elsewhere until the danger passed. The words were spoken carefully, their implications left deliberately vague, but everyone in the room understood the underlying meaning. Rebecca, despite her own genetic damage and limited cognitive capacity, retained enough maternal instinct to react with horror to the suggestion. Caleb was her son, whatever his condition, and she would not allow him to be taken away or harmed. But Thomas overruled her objections with brutal efficiency. The family came first. The preservation of their way of life took precedence over any individual member. Caleb's condition was deteriorating regardless of what they did, and his presence during the examination would doom all of them to separation and destruction. The decision was made. Caleb would be taken to the old abandoned mineshaft that lay a mile from the compound, a place where the temperature remained constant and cool throughout the year. He would be left there with blankets and some food, kept hidden until the examination was complete. On the morning of February 8th, 3 days before the scheduled examination, Thomas and 2 other adult males prepared to remove Caleb from the compound. The boy, now 7 years old but appearing no more than 4, had declined to the point where he could barely walk. His temperature had spiked to 105 degrees during the night, leaving him confused and barely responsive. Rebecca wept as Thomas lifted the child, but she did not physically resist. The weight of family pressure, the years of conditioning that placed collective survival above individual welfare, prevented her from acting to save her son. She watched through the window as Thomas carried Caleb into the winter forest, the boy's flushed face visible against Thomas's shoulder until they disappeared among the trees. The mine shaft had been abandoned since the 1920s, a remnant of an earlier attempt to extract coal from the mountain. The entrance was partially collapsed, creating a narrow opening that led to a chamber about 15 feet deep. Thomas descended carefully, carrying Caleb in his arms, and placed the boy on a pile of blankets at the bottom. He left a jug of water and some dried meat, though he knew the child likely would not consume either. Then he climbed back out and partially blocked the entrance with stones and branches, making it difficult to spot from any distance. As he worked, he could hear Caleb below, making small sounds of distress, calling for his mother in a weak, fever-thickened voice. Thomas forced himself not to listen, not to think about what he was doing, focusing instead on the necessity of protecting the family. The examination took place on February 11th, as scheduled. Sarah Henderson arrived with 2 other medical professionals and a state social worker, prepared to thoroughly assess the Ember children. They were presented with 8 children, all showing some signs of genetic issues, but none immediately alarming. Sarah knew instantly that she was being deceived, her count of children from previous visits indicating that several were missing. She demanded to know where the others were, but was told they were visiting relatives in another county, a lie so transparent that it insulted her intelligence. But without concrete evidence and lacking authority to search the property beyond the main house, she could do little except complete the examination and note the discrepancies in her report. What Sarah did not know was that Caleb was dying less than a mile away, abandoned in darkness and cold. The mine shaft, which Thomas had chosen for its constant cool temperature, was indeed cooler than the heated cabins of the compound. For Caleb, whose body had never experienced true relief from his internal heat, the coolness was initially almost pleasant. But as hours stretched into days, as his body temperature gradually dropped from its constant fever pitch towards something closer to normal, his damaged regulatory system could not cope with the change. Used to fighting constantly to dissipate excess heat, his body did not know how to generate warmth when needed. His temperature began to fall, dropping below normal into hypothermic ranges, his small body shaking violently as it tried and failed to warm itself. On the 3rd day in the mine shaft, Caleb stopped moving. His body temperature had dropped to 92 degrees, his consciousness fading into a twilight state where he could no longer distinguish between reality and delirium. In his confused mind, he saw his mother's face, felt her arms around him, heard her voice singing the mountain songs she had taught him. He did not understand why he was alone, why the burning that had defined his existence was finally easing, why darkness was closing in. He did not know that above ground, the examination had concluded and the officials had departed, frustrated by the family's deception, but lacking grounds for immediate removal of the children they had seen. He did not know that Thomas had decided to wait an additional day before retrieving him, wanting to ensure the danger had fully passed. Sarah left the Ember compound on the 11th, knowing that something was terribly wrong, that children were being hidden, that Caleb specifically was not among those presented. She contacted state authorities that same day, demanding a more thorough investigation, requesting law enforcement involvement. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and it would be another week before officials could organize a return visit with proper authority to search the entire property. In the meantime, Caleb remained in the mine shaft, his condition deteriorating beyond any hope of recovery. Share your thoughts below and comment, why do we allow isolation to hide such horrors? This question haunts everyone who learns what happened next. On February 14th, Thomas returned to the mine shaft to retrieve Caleb. He descended into the chamber and found the boy's body cold and still, his skin no longer flushed, but pale and waxy, his chest motionless. Thomas lifted the small form, lighter than seemed possible for a human child, and carried him back to the compound. Rebecca's screams when she saw her dead son could be heard echoing through the hollow, a sound of grief and rage that seemed to shake the very mountains. But her anguish changed nothing. The family buried Caleb that same day in the family cemetery that lay behind the main house, a plot crowded with generations of Embers who had lived and died in isolation, their graves marked by simple stones or wooden crosses that bore only names and dates, nothing of the suffering their existence had entailed. The official investigation that finally occurred on February 20th discovered the fresh grave. Authorities demanded answers, and the family's story, that Caleb had wandered off and died of exposure, satisfied no one. But proving what had actually occurred, demonstrating that the child had been deliberately hidden in conditions that led to his demise, required evidence the family had effectively destroyed. The death was ruled accidental, and while the other hidden children were finally identified and removed from the compound for medical evaluation and potential foster placement, no criminal charges were filed in connection with Caleb's death. The Ember family had sacrificed their youngest and most vulnerable member to preserve their way of life, and they had escaped legal consequences for doing so. Sarah Henderson never forgave herself for not acting faster, for not finding a way to intervene before Caleb's death. She continued her work in Appalachia for another decade, but the image of that flushed, fever-bright child sitting in the corner of the smoke-filled cabin haunted her. She knew that Caleb had never understood his own condition, had never known that the burning he felt was abnormal, had never experienced what healthy existence felt like. He had been born into suffering, lived in suffering, and died in suffering, all because a family had chosen isolation and genetic preservation over the welfare of their children. His short life stood as testament to the devastation